And the consensus was that black people have a higher tolerance for pain than white people. Now, you might say that's not a very surprising finding when you ask whites that somehow blacks endure pain more easily. But the fact is, the findings showed that both white and black respondents responded that blacks have a higher tolerance for pain. In other words, it's a presumption about racial difference, about the reality and durability of racial difference. I mean, that's just one study, but I think you can see how it persists. And therefore, this conviction of the reality of racial difference has persisted consistently since the American inception. Okay, so now, so that's really how I start. That's the beginning. Then I say, now I start moving into the more psychoanalytic material. And I say, well, how does this get passed on, this from generation to generation, the notion of racial difference? What's the mechanism that produces in each generation the continual conviction about racial difference, even in spite of all, let's say, all the good efforts to say, you know, again, all people are created equal, et cetera, that it seems to get carried on. And so this is where I turn, and this is really, it's my own creation, and I'm not sure how, well, I don't know how strongly I will stand against criticism, but this is, so I actually, what I say, and what I think about America, first of all, is the only society, maybe with the exception of South Africa, in which racial category is the primary organizer of social difference. No other society uses race so centrally as a category of distinction. And I argue in this paper that the racial category is as central in being an American as almost as central, I say, as gender identity. That it actually in the same way, and here I realize that what I'm trying to describe is really what Bourdieu talks about is in terms of the habitus, or dispositions. And so what I argue is that it becomes extremely important in this society to figure out where you stand in relationship to this binary. Now, immigrants, of course, are kind of free-floating. But the pressure is, and all the evidence is that the pressure is, of course, that immigrants attempt to become white. And in fact, they have become white. And partly, it's by beginning to share much of the prejudice, the anti-black prejudice. But I say that this identity, this racial identity, is the primary civil identity of being an American. The primary, the civil public identity. That the primary private identity is gender. And that operates very early on in the home. And we don't really think about it in these ways, the family and early family life. But what we're doing is we're gendering our children. Not just by teaching, but just by our relationship, family relationships. So that we end up, children come out of the family knowing that they're boys or girls. And I say that I think that what happens in American society is that children are forced to understand themselves racially earlier than perception allows, or not allows, but would otherwise be. In other words, adults are very conscious of race, naturally. We all are. And in fact, we think it incumbent upon ourselves in various ways, sometimes conscious, other times unconscious, to socialize our children into racial categories. So my example, just one anecdote, but it's my example of my 4-year-old son, who apparently, not to my awareness, but in terms of his perception of other people and he didn't organize his world along color categories, phenotypical differences at age 4. And I think there's evidence, sort of more neuroscience evidence, to support this. He was in preschool, and just before Martin Luther King holiday, the teacher felt that it was her obligation and duty to educate kids about Martin Luther King and about civil rights and about slavery. So he comes home now, in a way, with a set of categories imposed upon him that I think were prematurely imposed. I call it traumatic. And I'll try to explain why I call it. It's also true, for example, when African American parents feel compelled, and in some sense rightly so, to make sure their children understand that they're perceived in a particular way, even though they may not understand it themselves. And so African American parents educate their children in race. And I say, I think it's premature. Because my argument psychoanalytically is that it is, I call it traumatic, because I think that what happens when you're told, when a child is told prematurely, there are black people and there are white people, and you're white or you're black, and that emerges before it should in terms of natural child development. It's experienced by children as a kind of a rupture to their world, a traumatic rupture, which means they have suddenly been kind of forced to see that the world is broken and not whole. That is, children, it's sort of, at some age you may remember or think about when children discover that human beings die, and how tender that moment is, how careful you have to be around that moment, how troubling it is. Well, I say, and that usually happens later than this, but I say that I think that we see this not just in the schools and somewhat in the families, but we'll see it in the media, we'll see it in all sorts of ways in which children are exposed. They're taught that there are two kinds of people in this world. There are whites and there are blacks. And it's a kind of sense, it's a way of experiencing the world as not whole. It's not safe and secure and contained as family life for most kids had felt to them. And I always think, again, a completely trivial example, but I always think about when I'm with someone that I know quite well, and they're 5 or 6 or 7 years old, and I have a Band-Aid on my hand, they get very alarmed, and they want to know, what is it? What's the matter? You're broke. I mean, in a sense, there's a sense you're not whole. And you say, oh, it's just a little bruise. It will go away. Nothing to worry about. But it's that kind of danger that I think, that kind of developmental process that gets disrupted early in America through the category of race. And so, and it's traumatic, and therefore has to be dealt with. It's dealt with, in a way, I think, by intensifying and strengthening the sense of difference that children take a traumatic moment. I mean, this is only one way of thinking about it, that is in terms of child development. But I also, so that's one part, and then I'll give you one other part, and then conclude, or so we can open it up for discussion. The other part is that you can think of it much like when Fanon was writing about Algeria, and other people, Sartre and Memy, these people that I studied in graduate school, they were talking about what the genius of Fanon. The genius of Fanon was to say you cannot have an oppressive or dominating social structure that doesn't inform or influence the psyche of individuals who live in it. You just can't, and you can't not think about the intersection of structure and psyche. And so he developed a whole idea, really, of the colonized psyche, and then the route to liberation. For him, the only way a colonized psyche, people who are not recognized as human beings, treated as nothing in a colonial setting. He argued in Wretched of the Earth and other, that the only way that they can purge themselves of that internalized sense of themselves is through collective violence. And that's why Fanon was such a radical figure and so criticized by powers that be. So I say, so my argument then is, well, I don't think it's an apt parallel to say that we're in a similar situation with respect to race here as Algeria or Tunisia or Morocco was when they were writing. But I say that we do have a kind of a psychic response to this traumatic injury. And the traumatic response, I argue, and that's really the title of my paper, is a kind of a melancholic relationship to the world, what I call racial melancholia. And I borrow that from Freud's essay, Mourning and Melancholia, which is a wonderful essay, in which he tries to distinguish between what he calls healthy mourning and melancholic mourning. Healthy mourning is when someone who you love, care about, is gone. And so there's a whole process in which you withdraw from the world and you identify with the person and you think about it and nothing else matters. But over time, really what Freud says is you begin to realize, well, that person, either my feelings that I'm glad I'm alive and that person is dead, or the kind of what he calls the ambivalent feelings, come to have some place, and you can then take on life again, realizing, well, I'm here and I have to live my life. And mourning is really, and you're able to, but melancholia, he says, is a sense of there being an unconscious, typically an unconscious loss, something that you can't even identify, that continues to plague you. And he says it doesn't have to be a person. It can be a flag. It can be a nation. It can be an idea. But something lost. So you could think about, let's say, the Greek immigrant who comes to America and becomes depressed. You could say, well, maybe it has something to do with the sense that Greece for him or her is gone. And they remain, there's no way to get through it. And the important feature that Freud describes about that, the problem with melancholy, and the reason why it's such a problem, is because you turn those feelings, you can't really identify, but they're turned on you and you feel less than whatever it is that you're mourning. You're not a good Greek. You're not as good a person, or something like that. You attack yourself. So my argument is that we have a melancholic relationship to the issue of race, which means we have a very high degree of tolerance for the inequality that exists. A belief, really, unconsciously, that there's nothing that really can be done. We live in a broken world. We live in a world that's divided between whites and blacks. And we just have to live with it. And so that's my psychoanalytic diagnosis, really, of contemporary society. We live with the sense, and so we live with enormous contradictions in the world. We see, just think about Katrina, just think about that, and how the response, how tepid it was, and how lukewarm it was, and how, people, said that's a terrible thing. Lots of people, university people said that's a terrible thing. But there wasn't absolute indignation and outrage because it was happening to black people. That is, but it's all, I'm saying it's not that these are right-wing bigots. It's a kind of unconscious acquiescence to the reality of difference, racial difference, in which we actually, without our maybe even wanting to, apply different standards of expectation. And I don't mean in this case that it's only whites who do that. I'm saying this is a collective problem in the present of a certain kind of acquiescence to the reality. And so, I'll stop here, but so inequality, these patterns of inequality in almost every sphere of social life become taken for granted, part of the picture, and explicable because of a sort of an unconscious conviction that the world is broken and it is manifest through racial inequality. Okay, so, and now I'll open it up to the floor. Yeah.
That, I think, is a really provocative analysis. I'm just wondering to what extent you would see an analogy to the gender difference. Freud would say, the moment that a little boy realizes that the girl is different, right, and doesn't have something that he has, leads to this double response. Well, I've got something you don't have on one hand, and on the other hand, oh, she lost it, I might lose it, right? The he calls the castration complex. So do you see any kind of analogy there? Was your argument, I wasn't quite clear on it, that the gender differences that children would recognize is primary, right? And that this then racial difference would be secondary?
Well, it's certainly gender difference is earlier, I think. That gets shaped earlier, and the struggle is earlier because it's largely internal to the family. But I think, it's a good question. I actually tried to draw out the parallel that I'm drawing, what I say, and it's hard, and maybe Naomi can help me on this, but so what I say about the little boy, according, in terms of the Oedipal framework or something, is that the little boy, in fact, becomes worried about, well, this is actually Jessica Benjamin's argument in Bonds of Love. But the little boy becomes overwhelmed with the danger of being engulfed by his love for his mother, the overwhelming mother, and therefore pulls away and says, I'm a boy, not a girl. And in fact, is very much works to, in all of his being, to demonstrate his masculinity. There's always threats to it, and he's always, so, and what I argue, though, and according to this kind of model, it explains, however, not the shift, not the shift away from the desire for the mother, and a shift towards the desire for another girl, for a girlfriend, for a sexual object. And I say, I mean, that with respect to race, it doesn't work quite that way. But what's so interesting, of course, about race is the way, historically, it has become so sexualized. So that the sense of having to be different, where what's experienced as the brokenness of the world, that I'm white and not black, leads to a constant effort on the part of whites, certainly in the South, to take all the features that is, I'm not really able to answer this very well, but you think about a way of demarcating themselves, separating themselves from blacks, distinguishing themselves from blacks, and through all kinds of mechanisms, including lynching, castration, separation, isolation, exclusion, all the kind of strategies that you might think little boys are engaged with in demonstrating that they're men, you might find kind of a parallel that whites have done to demonstrate their separateness, distinction from blacks, and attributing all sorts of properties that they don't want to identify in themselves onto blacks. But there's also, it can go the other way too, and I would say there can become a tremendous fascination with blacks, a romanticization of blacks, an idealization of blacks. And my point here, and that happens, and we can say that, and lots of good has come out of that, but it still means that the individuals are not seen as individuals, they're seen as categorical. That is, you're identified in terms of the category of race. I would like you to read those 3 pages. I did a better job in there than I think.
I'm going to preface this question by saying that I'm asking you to put on your sociologist hat to answer it. You indicated reasonably that the United States and South Africa share a particularly profound racial problem, or racialization of the organization of society. But I'm wondering whether it really is so unique. And I'm thinking, as a Latin Americanist, I'm thinking in particular of Brazil and Uruguay, where there has been splendid social science scholarship on racial issues, and where the conjunction of psychology and sociology is manifest very beautifully in a recent novel from Brazil called Spilled Milk. I don't know if you've heard Spilled Milk, which revolves around the question of whether someone's mistress long ago was black or white. I can't remember the author's name, but you can track it down very easily on Google. But at any rate, do you think that there is, in fact, a qualitative difference between the Brazil-Uruguay racial situation and, say, the North American one?
Well, when I was a graduate student and was doing that reading,
Yeah.
the line was, and I really don't know much of the contemporary literature,
Yeah.
but the line was is that there were many, many variations allowed for in Brazil, or to describe racial variation. And in fact, it was largely overlapping. The perception of race largely overlapped with the perception of class position. And so that in effect, the richer you were, the whiter you became.
Mhm.
So that was my understanding of the difference between Latin American formerly slave societies.
It's an interesting intersection which I think deserves further exploration. Take a look at that novel by all means.
I will.
Yeah. There's also an excellent book published a few years ago about Carnival in Montevideo. And I don't have the title of it. It has a title that doesn't really refer to what it's about. It's something like Blackness in a White Society.
Yeah.
But I'll email you the reference.
Yeah, good. I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Well, I'm wondering, I sort of feel like it might be a good thing if they were melancholic. What I'm worried about is that they're not melancholic. That we're actually seeing what I would call, some kind of massive denial as opposed to even melancholy. And I think about that from having lived in, I think two quick stories, when I lived in Israel and somebody asked me, 20 years ago, asked me whether I had lunch with somebody, they said, well, were they Jews or were they Arabs? And I said, I didn't know. And she was like, you can't have lunch with somebody and not know that. And she said 20 years later, she was still asking me whether these people were. And she never met anybody who could have lunch with somebody and not know who they were having lunch with. So, so in other words, that kind of process happens in many cultures where you have to differentiate because, so whether or not it's on black, white. But in that culture, I didn't think there was a lot of melancholy at all. I thought there was just manic denial, which is a little different in the sense that it's a manic denial of the superiority you get by the total disowning of what you want to disown. And I'm not sure that's really the same as melancholy. So that was just one
That's a
thing.
good question.
One question. And then the second one is, I think if we're trying to be optimistic, we could look at aliens. Because the thing I think, and I think this is America's interest in aliens because they're brave. And I think alien UFOs, and I can give you a few references, are more different than we are from each other. So the entire alien movement in television and in abduction theory is an attempt to see people that make us all look more like each other. Because as far as the aliens are concerned, they are not binary in terms of how they think of humans. So there's some weird optimistic moment there that I think is kind of a strange thing, but that, Hollinger's post-ethnic America, I think we are moving to an alien abduction theory, and we will have something that we're, but I think it may be class, which may not, I'm not sure that would be a whole lot better
Right.
than where we were, or than going back to religion or all the other possibilities. So I don't know, but, so that just seems to me to be, in other words, I'm not sure where we actually are at this moment.
Okay, well, to that question, I mean, because there are many, many people who, I think there was even a time or something, they had a picture of the average, and they did this kind of morphing of the blending of the groups and what the American would look like in 2050 or something like that, and the idea that we're moving towards a post-racial society, that there are so many different groups of people, that there are, where there's lots of intermarriage and all, and that was actually a whole kind of social science after Obama got elected, that this is proof that things are changing. With respect to that, I think there is, what I would say is I think there is truth to that, to an extent, and my prediction is that the various Asian populations over the next 20 or 30 years will be seen as white, but there will still be a black population. That in fact, that distinction is not going to disappear. And that's really part of that, because it's too deeply rooted culturally in our way of understanding ourselves as a nation. So that's my view about that. this Arab-Israeli thing is interesting because actually one of the things that I think got me started on this was 40 years ago, was my first time in the early 70s when I went to Europe. And I went there, I was at 22 or 23 years old. And everyone I encountered, they had to know, was I Jewish? And it was a question to me that was completely like out of left field. And of course, it was their central organizing principle. It was the category of Jew and Gentile that was, that has to be figured out before you can, it's sort of like, are you a boy or a girl? It has to be figured out first. So with respect to this, in